I want to begin by thanking our staff, as I do every time, because it is because of them that we're able to get our voice out to our Price community and our community of especially local electeds through our Local Leaders Forum, which this series is part of. I'm delighted today to have a very dear friend of mine. I consider him a family, as he was my former law partner before I came to academia. We practiced law together, David and I, for many, many years. And he is one of the most talented and most scholarly lawyers I know on this topic of especially financial crises in the municipal setting. So I invited him to be with me today to talk about something extremely important for our local governments, in particular post COVID-19. My message today, and our message today, is first certainly one of hope and at the same time one of extreme importance about governance and leadership. If there is ever a time for our local leaders to govern as well as lead, this is the time. This is not the time about politics. This is not about red or blue. This is not about pointing finger, whether we should be open or closed. Those debates will come. About a month ago or so, I predicted a bunch of lawsuits would be filed and on constitutional grounds, and they are being filed. In fact, on specific grounds that I even mentioned on this platform. So I'm not surprised. But having said that, today's purpose is not about finger pointing, and it's not about the lawsuits themselves. It's about paying attention to what we can do to govern well and lead our communities. So we hope, David and I, to touch upon the important things that you can do. So our message is very simple. Our message is for you to look at your financial condition now, as opposed to waiting more and more time going by, because nothing is going to change from that perspective. We wrote an article in Public CEO. So for those of you who have not seen it, please log on publicceo.com. And if you type David's name or my name, the article will come up. We wrote about certainly this topic, which is about local governments must plan without delay for post-pandemic fiscal realities. Those realities will not change. Therefore, we really want you to focus on what you can do today. And we have a bunch of things that we can talk about. And we hope to be able to touch on a bunch. And we hope to be able to turn to you for questions that you may have. Already we're seeing and we're hearing about a bunch of our local jurisdictions really grasping for air, really grasping for help. The other simple message is, please don't go at this alone. Feel free to contact me. I'll be happy to send you a bunch of resources your way. And please consult professionals in order for you to be able to plan for this, because it will happen. It's not an if, it's a when. Most of our jurisdictions have only few sources of income. Property tax, sales tax, TOT. Frankly, maybe property tax is the exclusion, maybe, and I'm not sure that it is. But frankly, sales tax, TOT are going to be decimated over the next several months, as they have been over the last few. The entire country expects substantial drop in GDP, and our local governments expect a huge drop in our income levels, while our expenses are there and potentially may augment as a result of COVID-19. So this is, again, not about pointing fingers. This is about looking at the realities and asking your staff to bring you the realities, no sugarcoating here, and then looking at those realities and acting on those realities. and the time to act is now. So with that, I'm going to turn to David and ask David to go through a litany of tests and checks, if you will, for you to go through, and few pieces of advice about hopefully a win-win negotiation process with every stakeholder that you have. This is not about, again, finger pointing, or this is not about taking advantage of various stakeholders. We're in this together. You as local governments need to lead and tap every stakeholder to be able to bring them to the table and make sure that you address your needs across the board with all of the stakeholders in order to be able to get out of it on the other end. So again, everything we say here, and I know David will go through specifics, everything we say here is with the great deal of respect and a great deal of care for all of the stakeholders that participate in local governments. This is not about taking advantage of any one of them. This is about bringing everybody together, all hands on deck, so to speak, to be able to deal with what is going to be a major fiscal crisis. So with that, David, I'm going to turn to you and ask you the fundamental question, of course, what do we do?
Well, thank you, Frank, and thank you to the Price community for having me. The consequences of the pandemic, as Frank is indicating, make it imperative that California's local governments focus on economic policy for the general public good. Top of mind, of course, right now is tapping into state and federal recovery resources. Those are unfortunately highly uncertain at this time. Hopefully they'll be there, but we don't know to what extent yet. And likely those will not be sufficient to close the gap. As Frank was indicating, local government stakeholders need to be engaged. So we're talking about unions, bondholders, retiree representatives, CalPERS, financial institutions, service providers, creditors, and any other stakeholders. And this engagement needs to be and should be intended and designed to initiate and implement what Frank was referring to, a collaborative process, focusing on, at the same time, specific interests, but really most importantly, the collective interests, with the paramount mission of serving the public being advanced, especially with regard to more vulnerable and underserved communities. That being said, in these unprecedented circumstances, it's incumbent upon local governments to develop and implement policies to protect reserves, maintain essential services, and retain the workforce intact to the extent feasible. The pandemic has and will continue to have negative impacts, as Frank was indicating, on sales taxes, on hotel or TOT taxes, on user fees, and on other municipal revenue sources. Further, with the recession and considerable uncertainty regarding the timing of recovery, and Frank alluded to this, future years' property taxes are likely to be negatively impacted. We don't know, but that's likely going to occur. Without early and immediate action, our concern is that some local governments could soon approach insolvency and then rapidly find that they're unable to pay debts when they come due or are unable to provide important services. In this scenario, local governments may be unable to repay internal borrowings before the end of the year when they need to do so. And while financial officers generally have immunity from personal liability, this protection disappears when there are known violations of the law. Further, as officials, I think, understand, they cannot allow employees to come to work if they know that the local public entity will be unable to pay them. So it's important to get out in front of these potential worst case scenarios. It's important that municipal officials recognize that fund balances do not necessarily equate to available cash, that the accuracy of underlying data, and we're talking about existing financial information, budget information, audits, and other available material, it's critical that it be accurate. The fundamental cash flow analysis that's going to be necessary and is necessary is really only as good as the underlying data and the assumptions. So city managers and treasurers also need to examine the danger of structural deficits burning through reserves. And with regard to financing, as already mentioned, the extent of federal and state assistance accessible for local governments is an ongoing issue with a lot of uncertainty. The accessibility to the municipal bond market is something to be explored for certain local governments and may or may not be available. Bank lines of credit may already be in place, and there may be some accessibility there. That's also to be considered. Short-term borrowings may be possible through notes in anticipation of tax or other revenues, as you know them, trans or rands. And possibly in some instances, and maybe many, there could be internal borrowing from pooled cash. However, the impact of COVID-19 on revenues may limit or otherwise impede these potential short-term fixes. So as Frank was indicating, we're going to try to list some actions that can be taken in order to chart a path forward. Local governments have a number of things that they can and should do, including, first, evaluate significant sources of revenue and expense categories to understand vulnerabilities. Another factor to consider is the unemployment rate. Next, pinpoint the major revenue streams at risk. Identify anticipated timing of the impacts. Discuss available options. Focus, because it's so important, on cash collection, so important in these kinds of circumstances. And then consider the effects of what's going on various funds. Of course, first there's a general fund in anticipation of reduction of sales tax, TOT, impact fees, and facility usage, potential reduction in assessed values, and potential CalPERS losses and increases in future unfunded liabilities. Next, consider effects on enterprise funds, potential reduction in commercial usage. There's no shut-off enforcement potentially, decrease in new connections, the impact of stay-at-home orders, or the impact just of behavior in general as a result of the pandemic, whether the orders are lessened or lifted, and the reduction in usage fees. Finally, looking at successor agencies and potential decrease in assessed value and reduction of future tax increment. Local governments should also build consensus within the governing council, commission, or board that early action is a necessity, not a choice, because it's important now not to get behind this, to be out in front. Discussions need to be initiated, as Frank referenced, with labor, with the workforce, with unions and other key creditor stakeholders. And this would include opening up the books and recognizing collaboratively, coming together and recognizing the impact on revenues during this difficult time and in the post-pandemic era. Finally, government should also determine how to provide first response services in the event of inability to fund staffing. Now, upon establishing policy, identifying potential impacts, and engaging with labor and other key creditor groups, local government should be prepared to take early action, including, first, placing contracts not critical to the government's mission on hold. Not something you ordinarily would want to do, but these are early action suggestions. Next, reducing capital spending. Next, having local businesses jump in to cover gaps in services where that's possible and economic. And further, reducing personnel costs, such as potentially eliminating leave cash outs, placing planned wage increases on hold, and considering implementing furloughs. And as a final resort, layoffs of non-essential positions. Now, it's advisable and really important that local public entities facing severe financial straits explore debt restructuring, moratoriums, and adjustments of debt as potential solutions. Such exploration takes place in the shadow of what is the resolution of last resort, Chapter 9 of the Bankruptcy Code. The initial focus, however, should be on accomplishing the necessary restructuring outside of court. In order to successfully negotiate, resolve issues, and achieve an out-of-court restructuring, local governments need to, first, as indicated already in this talk, evaluate the situation, cash flow, finances, availability of unrestricted funds, and develop financial and operational plans. Next, as indicated already, they need to commence negotiations with key stakeholders. The reality of a potential Chapter 9 filing encourages negotiation and creates momentum for an agreement. So hopefully that can get done without ever having to get into Chapter 9. And the local entity should prepare the outlines of a Chapter 9 plan, maybe a draft plan itself, or the outlines of a potential plan or a term sheet to help facilitate the negotiations. And as Frank mentioned, it's important to retain experienced professionals to provide guidance and representation. Now turning to Chapter 9. Chapter 9 is part of the Bankruptcy Code for governmental entities and local governmental entities. It provides a framework for local public entities to restructure debt and other obligations. While Chapter 9 is federal law, state law governs the gateway into Chapter 9. And in California, what's frequently referred to as AB 506 is what governs. There's a separate government code section, but AB 506 is the term that's generally used. And that requires potential municipal debtors, entities that might otherwise enter Chapter 9 in California, to engage in what's been characterized, what's stated in the statute as neutral evaluation. It's really a mediation process intended to be about a 60-day process before the entity is eligible to file for Chapter 9 relief, except in the event that the entity declares a fiscal emergency. The likelihood that payment and other obligations will be suspended during a Chapter 9 case and may be reduced or modified under a Chapter 9 plan, which is the goal, sort of the exit vehicle out of a Chapter 9 case, can create an environment that leads to negotiated changes. And those changes may be adequate to allow the local public entity to avoid Chapter 9 altogether. The mediation process allows confidential negotiations out of court. It provides a format or a forum to shape perceptions of liquidity and the feasibility of go-forward plans. If an agreement is reached with some or all of the key creditors, as indicated, Chapter 9 may be avoided or at least made more efficient because the entity, the local public entity, may be able to go in on sort of a streamlined basis, having lined up an agreement with the key parties. Now, the goal would be to avoid it altogether if possible. AB 506 was enacted after the Chapter 9 filing of Vallejo. Stockton was the first municipality that used the mediation process before its Chapter 9 filing. San Bernardino, in contrast, discovered it was out of cash, could not negotiate with creditors, declared a fiscal emergency, and went into Chapter 9, just entered Chapter 9, no mediation, just straight in because of its circumstances. And all cities should attempt to avoid ever getting anywhere near to that if possible, obviously. Unlike in Chapter 9 itself, there is no automatic stay that stops all litigation or other creditor action as part of the AB 506 mediation process. So accordingly, where an immediate stay is needed, the mediation process will not be a viable option. Now, Chapter 9 is designed to enable a municipality that is unable to pay its debts as they come due to continue to provide essential services while working out a plan to adjust its obligations. To avoid the disruption of necessary services, Chapter 9 facilitates the continuance of insolvent local public entities rather than their dissolution. Not unlike Chapter 11 reorganization for non-governmental entities, there are two primary benefits of Chapter 9. First, there's an automatic stay so that it creates a breathing spell. Immediately upon the commencement of a Chapter 9 case, there's a stay that goes into effect that puts all actions on hold. Second, there's the ability of the municipal entity to come forward with what is called a plan of debt adjustment. It's its reorganization plan. And it can adjust creditor claims and obligations under the plan and allow the municipality to exit Chapter 9 on a sustainable, viable, ongoing basis. The plan itself, when approved by the court, replaces the obligations under the plan, replace the prior obligations of the municipal entity. In summary, to avoid getting to the point of a fiscal emergency during and following the pandemic, local public entities should act proactively. If a proactive approach is not taken in time or is not sufficient, it may become necessary for a local public entity to engage in debt restructuring. However, restructuring of debt and other obligations should be conducted outside of court if possible. And that's done with Chapter 9 lurking in the shadows and only entered as a last resort. Hopefully, a collaborative approach is taken with stakeholders to reach common ground, protect essential services, and continue to promote the public good.
David, thank you. I want to emphasize or re-emphasize few of the salient points here before we open up for questions, as we have a couple more minutes here before questions. And that is the importance, as I said, our message is simple. We're asking you to govern, lead, be proactive. The time is now to look over the fiscal context of your municipal organization and recognize the issues that you potentially may need to face ultimately. To bring a little bit of context to this, recently in my city of Rolling Hills Estates, for example, we asked our staff as part of our quote, may revise, to look at and ask all of our contractors that actually work for the city to come up with estimations and a kind of a roadmap to where we see ourselves 6 months down the road and a year down the road. And I'll add, at this point in time, not just 6 months down the road, maybe a month down the road. So 6 months, given the uncertainty of the times, may be way too long of a time, although you need to be both tactical as well as strategic. You know, one of the courses within the courses I teach is strategic planning. And in the strategic planning and leadership language in academia, we use those terms for tactical being short-term and strategic being long-term. And this is the time to be both tactical as well as strategic. So your proactivity will pay dividends in the long run. And knowing where you might be 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, 6 months down the road, and prepare for it now as opposed to waiting for the impossible to occur. The importance of the narrative and your communication. Also part of ironically, one of the courses I teach, it's called Collaborative Governance. It's a graduate course that I teach in our MPA program, a Master in Public Administration program, where I talk to my students about the importance of each sector, how devastating it could be when you take down one or two of the sectors that actually collaborate to create governance as a whole. And here we are, right? This is a case study of it all, where a decimation of a private sector creates a decimation of the public sector, particularly at the local level. And even collaborative governance becomes even more important than ever before, where everyone needs to feel the win-win opportunity as opposed to win-lose opportunity in the discussions. So your communication and your narrative to your stakeholders is critical. It's not about them or you. Remember, I said this last time also, and I always remind my colleagues in elected office with me that it's not about us. It's about the people we serve. And that's a critical importance here, because if there is ever a time where service becomes so important, this is the time. So every stakeholder needs to understand what you're attempting to do and what the communication narrative is. It's about your constituents. And I'm extremely sad to say that we will have a disproportionate response and a disproportionate effect in some of our local governments in California and across the nation, as well as in the county of Los Angeles. And I'm further sad to say that unfortunately, our more vulnerable communities are going to be more vulnerable than those who are not. So my kind of claim to all of you, or my request from all of you, is that this is the time to focus on collaboration and regional help. And this is the time for both affluent and non-affluent cities to work regionally and to help each other to be able to make this work for the entire region. I think I'm going to stop here and turn to Harley so that we can field some questions. Of course, we're not going to have time to answer them all, but we'll do our best. And again, if you have any questions, please write them down for Harley to read to us so that we can answer them. And to the extent that we don't get them all, by all means, Harley will get them to us. David and I will be more than happy to respond to you individually. And finally, as I said, please feel free to reach out. Don't be shy. This is the time for us to help each other. I will be more than happy to talk to you. I'm sure David will be more than happy to talk to you and give you various resources that may be available for you to tap to be able to serve your communities and your constituents. Harley?
Great, thank you. So we have questions coming in, and feel free to type them into the Q&A function. The first question is, if the city can help the central business district, it may reduce the long-term fiscal impacts to the city. What can local governments do to help businesses, since future tax sales revenue is needed to help the circle of taxes and services in play?
So let me answer generally, and then if David has anything to add, by all means. But generally speaking, I mean, this is what we're talking about, right? All of this is going to be affected. Yes, of course, we're going to need to promote businesses, and we're going to need to help our business districts as much as possible. But then again, when you have a potential shortage on the back end that supplements or provides that resource, so to speak, then this becomes more difficult. And part of the the narrative today that we have, or the simplicity of our message, is that this is exactly why you want to know every fund, everything that is going to come in the future, at least an estimation of what those might be, so that you can react or act, not only just the business district, but other potential stakeholders that might need your help in this pandemic. David?
Yeah, I would just echo what Frank's saying, and that there needs to be a careful analysis and evaluation, as we're indicating, that in essence comes up with the go-forward plan and brings in the key stakeholders so that everybody's in it together and feels that they're being heard. And it's a challenging and difficult situation. There's obviously a lot of uncertainty, but that needs to be built in. There are different scenarios in terms of different assumptions underlying the go-forward projections. There's a lot of things that you would want to do under ordinary times that you just may not be able to do. On the other hand, there's certain support that may create greater revenue that's really necessary. So there's going to need to be a balancing and a close look at all of these things, all the revenue sources.
Okay. Next question is, do we anticipate large-scale default on municipal bonds as a result of COVID? Are there any state/federal backstops or support to help avoid that?
David, you want to take that?
I think the answer is we don't know. I think there's an assumption that there will be some level of default on municipal bonds throughout the country, but the extent of support that will be received from the federal and state levels is highly unknown at this time. There was obviously a House bill passed last week, which I have not studied, that talked about a lot of support. On the other hand, at this point, that bill itself, I think even the proponents of the bill recognize it's not going to go through as presented. So it's an area where there's just a lot of uncertainty how much federal and state government will step in. I think there'll be some federal government support for the bond markets, but at the same time, there's likely to be a level of default that we haven't seen in recent years, but that remains uncertain at this time.
The only thing I would add to that is that do not forget that your bondholders are part of your stakeholders as well. I'm sure that they don't want to see default as much as you don't want to see default. So this could be part of your plan in engaging them and discussing with them just as well. Here, professional help, again, can be really beneficial because at the end of the day, a bondholder does not necessarily want to see knowing the circumstance they know. They have to be hidden under a rock somewhere on Mars not to figure out that we're in a pandemic. So at the end of the day, I highly encourage you to engage that group as well as any other.
And it's a lot like what is in process or early stages of occurring in the business world outside of government in terms of debt restructuring, initially forbearance arrangements, and workouts that allow the borrower to continue to service the debt potentially or defer servicing the debt during the emergency, and ultimately have a performing obligation, a performing debt instrument or bond going forward. So I think there will likely be a lot of restructuring that hopefully will be, as Frank was indicating, on a collaborative, consensual basis.
Next question is, what do you think the prospects are for federal relief for state and municipal government?
Well, David just mentioned that bill, but to be honest, from a political standpoint, that particular bill passing both houses and through the administration is highly unlikely. And unfortunately, the sad part of this pandemic, that's another discussion for another day, is the politicization of the entire process. And that's sad because some for political reasons will actually resist the legitimate need of local governments and the importance of the constituents that we all serve without regard to who did what and why, etc. That may be all well and good. As I tell my students all the time, in the political context, you can talk all you want, but in our context of public administration, we just need to take care of things. We just cannot afford to talk. So at the end of the day, it's unfortunate that it's going to be all subject to a lot of political discussion and rancor. I don't anticipate, to be honest with you, too much help from the federal entities into the states and into the local governments. I'm not that optimistic. That doesn't mean that there will not be any. It may be some, but I can unequivocally say that I am confident there will be a gap. And this is why we're talking to you, to deal with that gap.
Okay, next question is, are cities looking at how to reform or revise CEQA to allow faster economic development?
I'm sorry, but I'm not familiar with that. What is it? CEQA. David, are you familiar with that acronym?
I assume they're talking about environmental requirements.
Oh, CEQA? Oh,
C-
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay, sorry. Because I'm just listening to you, Harley, and I'm not seeing it on paper. So
I know.
that's okay. That's quite all right. So repeat the question again. What about CEQA?
The question is, sorry, they sent this one to me in an email. Are cities looking at how to reform and revise CEQA to allow faster economic development?
So that's outside the purview of this talk, but I can say to that questioner that various organizations have been working with that prospect in the state, including, of course, SCAG, Southern California Association of Governments, where I serve on one of the policy committees. This is part of a constant discussion between the state and local governments in order to create more housing, the need to actually revamp or the need to actually make CEQA more friendly to local governments that would not suit on a regular basis when we're attempting to create housing, for example. So my brothers and sisters, certainly in local governments, will understand that pain and what we go through in that context. But the answer is yes, there's always a discussion between local government and state to be able to facilitate, especially in today's world, more housing, especially in the context of our RHNA numbers, regional housing numbers that we need to satisfy in order to be able to house more Californians.
Okay, next question. I'm going to jump around a little. Thank you for everyone sending in these great questions. Next question is, Boston University just announced to stop contributing to employees' pension. It appears to be a common strategy for large employers to reduce its fiscal obligation in the short term. Could cities take the same strategies and stop contributing to their employees' retirement benefit? How long could it go on? A year, 3, or indefinitely?
So I'll start with the university part because the fact that private universities can do a bunch of things does not necessarily mean that public structures like in a pension system can do the same without any kind of law, so to speak, in authorizing it. So it's hard to compare a private setting with a public setting, and our municipalities, of course, are public settings. Now, if our municipalities have done anything more creative, so to speak, like the setting of a 401k on a discretionary basis, et cetera, I'm not referring to that. But dealing with the public pension system is, in my judgment, is going to require a set of laws. David?
Yeah, there's the general concept that exists that contract rights cannot be impaired except based on constitutional protections, the Contracts Clause of the US, and in our case, California constitutions, except in a couple of instances. One is a declared financial emergency, and then that situation is on a limited basis during the course of the emergency and the extent needed to address the emergency. And the other situation is in a bankruptcy context where contract rights can be altered, adjusted, potentially eliminated. Now, with respect to the issue raised, we would go back to our concept of hopefully a collaborative approach to resolving municipal issues. And we also, in representing non-governmental entities, that's generally the goal as well from the business world. But so there may be situations where pensions as they now exist and or healthcare retiree benefits are viewed as unsustainable, and the parties need to come together and examine that and try to address it in a way that ultimately makes it work and hopefully protects the stakeholders that have, devoted their lives to these jobs. But there's not a simple answer in some situations. And even before the pandemic, the state auditor has a website that identifies municipalities with issues. And sometimes one of those issues relates to a pension obligation. So it's out there. It's out there. And hopefully will get addressed when needed on a collaborative type basis.
Okay. Next question is, what about federal help being allocated based on local governments adhering to current administration political favoritism?
Not sure I exactly understand the question, but I don't think that the federal government is going to be able to pick and choose which local governments they help or which local governments they don't help from an actual legal structure, especially with funding, because funding is more of the function of the Article 1 organization, which is Congress. So I don't know. Again, I'm not sure about the question, but that, to me, this is not a pick and choose thing.
Okay.
I would just say the way the question's framed, it seems inappropriate for that to occur and probably illegal, if I'm understanding it correctly.
Okay. Next question is, are there any safeguards in place in the U.S. to compel wealthier cities, municipalities to assist lower income municipalities on the regional level, or would that be in the realm of mutual aid, MOUs, etc.?
First of all, there is a lot that cities regionally do in collaboration with one another already. So it's not like wealthier cities or more affluent cities are islands and don't participate in regional governance. That is not true. There is so much that mutual aid, of course, is one example, but there are transportation examples, for example, providing doing roads, etc., that are used by other cities, not just for cities. When we do roads in Rolling Hills Estates, for example, we don't close the streets to non-residents. We allow everyone to pass through those roads. So it would be kind of difficult to imagine cities not working in conjunction with each other. And there are a bunch of organizations like SCAG, for example, Southern California Association of Governments, where 192 cities get together across 6 counties to collaborate on various topics, including RENA, housing, homelessness, and others. I mean, there's so many topics that we collaborate on. But if the question is, can a affluent city write a check to a non-affluent city? The answer is no, because that would be gifting public funds, and that would not work anyway under law. So that's not possible. But collaboration already exists, and I certainly advocated earlier, and I will continue to advocate that we need to think regionally when it comes to difficulties like this, and actually accommodate all of our brothers and sisters across the county in 88 cities and 482 cities across California, and then some.
Next question is, what are cities' thoughts about maintaining memberships in collaborative organizations such as SCAG, COGs, League of Cities, etc.?
Frankly, more than ever, I think that it is important to engage with your, again, colleagues across the region. So my recommendation certainly is organizations like SCAG, organizations like California Contract Cities, for example, League of Cities, California Contract Cities certainly, or independent cities. California Contract Cities, for example, which actually partners with us in these price talks, really preserves the interest of all of our contracting cities. There are 44 of them in the county of LA, for example, and they're going to be instrumental in discussions with the sheriff, with the fire department, and other contracting organizations. So the time to collaborate with them is now, actually, not to cut down on those types of relationships, because they're going to be facilitating more collaboration rather than less.
Okay. The next question is, why can't the federal government print the funds needed to make the state and municipal governments solvent? Based on the Fed's QE, it should not increase inflation without adding the printed funds to the national debt.
I think you should ask that question to the federal government. David nor I are qualified to speak for them, nor can we explain what fiscal policy ought to be, or how they view monetary policy. So that's really beyond our expertise here.
Okay. Next question is, in a region where there is no current city tax revenue sharing model, how would you propose to start one in this crisis situation? It's always hard. Now it would seem to be impossible. Regionalism is a great idea, but implementation is the challenge.
Yeah, implementation is always a challenge. I mean, that's part of, those of us who serve in public office and those of us who are in public administration. As I always say, frankly, implementation is everything. So we can talk all day long, but if we can't implement, it won't work. So there are some ideas out there, by the way, especially in the context of housing, that are floating around in coming up with solutions that are more regional, a la, for example, a cap and trade type of a program in order to create a land trust or a housing trust to be able to work through the housing challenges, for example. So I can envision other types of joint powers associations or joint powers organizations, special districts collaborating in creating various types of structures that may be helpful regionally. But there are some, as I mentioned, a couple of them as examples.
Next question. Who are some of the key community stakeholders, service providers that need to be brought into the process early on?
Well, first of all, I would say all of them. I mean, your employees, your lenders, your pension holders, your JPIA, the insurers that you have, if you're a contract city, your trash haulers, your engineers. I mean, it's a litany of people that actually needs to be consulted and discussed. And that's why we're saying that this is not easy. You need a plan for this, and you need to figure out from the get-go how you're going to bring all these people together on an interest-based discussion, because everyone has an interest, and sometimes those interests are not the same. But here, the interest and the discussion needs to boil down to people we serve, because otherwise they're going to be decimated. I mean, multiplying any number with a zero is still a zero. So at the end of the day, we need to figure out what that multiplier is going to be, and hopefully not zero.
Okay. Next question is, how can cities have more influence input with CalPERS regarding the impact of increased unfunded liabilities that will be surely a result of post-COVID circumstances?
Yeah, this is a huge question, by the way, and frankly, David was alluding to a list of cities that are already on the state controller's website with respect to funding or a lack of funding of their liability when it comes to CalPERS. CalPERS, frankly, has, even before COVID, reduced their what was, frankly, a relatively optimistic view of their return, although with an amazing market that was going on pre-COVID and a very strong economy, one may argue that their optimism was being well served. But they did reduce it by about 0.5% as far as their expectation. My guess is that there are a number of studies out there, Brookings and others, that look at this, and some of them claim, and there's a California organization as well, a not-for-profit NGO type that looks at this. Some claim that that number ought to be more closer to 3 rather than 7. So again, I don't know. I'm not the expert at that or actuarials, etc. But there are real concerns post-COVID as to what the gap is going to be. And all I can say to those communities that actually have a very large gap already existing in funding their portion of the liability, frankly, I'm sorry to say, but that gap is only going to get larger. Some cities are funded at levels of 80% or a little over 80%, which is wonderful because funding 100% is not possible anyway, because it's a kind of a moving target on a regular basis. But some cities are in the 50% range. And that gap is even going to increase, unfortunately, post-COVID. David, anything to add?
No, I don't think so. In terms of the overall picture, that is a major, major issue for certain cities and needs to be addressed along with other issues that have now arisen, assuming they have. And even if they haven't, that was an issue that was hanging out there and ultimately should not continue to be put off indefinitely. It needs to be addressed at some point.
Okay, next question is, what about the use of emergency ordinances to help local businesses get going? For example, allowing outside seating for restaurants and public spaces on an emergency basis.
That's a great question. Actually, frankly, I'm not sure that you need much of an emergency for that. My hope and anticipation is that the County of Los Angeles is on the verge of making that decision. And my hope and my prayer is to my good friends on the Board of Supervisors, frankly, is, if there are any of them listening to us right now, is to allow a less of a one-size-fits-all approach and allow our local communities, various cities, to facilitate such opportunities for our restaurants who frankly have been absolutely decimated as a result of these orders. So we are definitely, I can tell you, speaking of my city, we're looking very actively in street closures, sidewalk closures, a bunch of other ideas that we may have in attempting to facilitate, again, with socially distancing table setups, various sizes of table setups to allow outdoor dining, which will be relatively safe, of course, as long as everybody is responsible, exercise social distancing, as well as wearing of masks when they come, and of course taking them off only at the time that they're eating at their socially distanced tables. So there is a way to address this, but we're waiting for additional orders from the county and the state to allow our local jurisdictions to facilitate some of these things. That's a great question. I hope you do.
For regional solutions, are there any not always traditional private-public partnerships that should be looking into for possibly contracting specific traditional municipality provided services at a lower rate than being done internally for the time being? Example, special districts, social districts, public higher education institutions. That's
a topic of itself. I mean, I probably need several hours to answer that question because I am academically interested on public-private partnerships. I write about the topic, etc. But generally speaking, all I can say is that, look, when I said all hands on deck, I mean all hands on deck. And actually, prompting various sectors, public, private, not-for-profit, citizens, sectors, all participating in finding solutions to problems. And frankly, I would say to my colleagues in local governments that we need to define those interests in each of these sectors so that they can participate freely and willingly. Because like I said, at the end of the day, any number multiplied by 0 is still a 0. And none of us want that 0. The public sector, the private sector, not-for-profit sector, and the citizen sector particularly. So it behooves us all to look at various options. And again, not point fingers, not become political. And again, I'm not picking on any particular organization or people, but this is the time for everyone. Organizations, owners, workers, labor, everyone to get together to be able to help the process.
All right, our final question. At what point does the continued lockdown constitute a taking by Governor Newsom?
Another interest of mine, and that's something I talked about a month ago. To be honest, I'm not going to speak to the direct issue of the state, but generally speaking, it is my view that when police powers, as I mentioned last time, are very important powers. They are recognized by the Constitution of California, Article 11, Section 7, and they are recognized in the Supreme Court of the United States, which has validated respective police powers of the states and local governments. Having said that, my concern about a month ago was that there's going to come a time where the police power objectives are going to be different, and the relevance of various scientific data and measures are going to change. So the approach of this 2 months ago is not the approach of it today. So as things change, my anticipation about a month ago was, and it still is, that as things change, the less likely it is to justify and use police powers, and therefore triggering, of course, number of provisions of the United States Constitution and the California Constitution, of course, taking being one of them. And there are many others, of course, that can potentially be triggered. So I think, to be honest, I can't speak for the governor, or I can't speak for the state. I can't speak for anyone who's using these powers, but I feel for them because I can't see that any one of them are wishing to exercise police powers for nothing. I think their hearts are in the right place. They're all attempting, although there's disagreement on topics, I believe everyone is attempting to preserve the public interest and preserve the public health, generally speaking. But then again, when you're dealing with Constitution, when you're dealing with constitutional republic, a free nation with bunch of laws, things become more dicey. So I leave it at that.
Okay. Well, thank you, Frank. Thank you, David. And thank you to everyone that joined us today for our Price Talks. We really appreciate it. And we hope you'll join us again. Next week, we have 2, one on Wednesday and one on Thursday. Thank you so much.